All right. Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Blockchain Socialist podcast, and we are continuing our overthrow of the network state. I'm here with Primavera de Filippi, the high priestess of Blockchaingov, and we're going to be talking to Jason Potts. Jason is a professor of economics and the co-director of the Blockchain Innovation Hub of RMIT. And so I think this interview will be pretty interesting since for the most part, so far in the series, we've been talking to people who've been quite, who are already quite critical of Balaji and quite critical of kind of what he talks about, what he stands for. But Jason's a little bit different. As far as I understand, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Jason has, more positive views towards Balaji than many of our previous guests and probably myself as well. But that's all right. But he also has some pretty interesting criticisms about the network state from that point of view. So maybe we can get started on that. Jason, if you want to introduce yourself and also talk maybe a bit about, Jason before he read the network state and Jason after he's read the network state. What are your thoughts about it at a high level? What are the things that you think are interesting, that you like, and what are the things that you are more critical about?
Yeah, thanks for having me on this podcast. This is a real pleasure. I'm an academic economist. I work in a university. The thing I do and have been doing for 20 years or even more is I study the nature and causes of long-run economic growth. Touching on political economy, a lot of work on innovation and entrepreneurial dynamics and institutional economics. I'm one of the editors of the Journal of Institutional Economics. So the topic that Balaji has been talking about is very much in my wheelhouse from a number of directions in terms of theory. But I've also, I've been following Balaji for a long time. He's an interesting thinker. Like him or hate him, he's not boring. He has interesting ideas. And I was sort of very keen to, when the network state came out, looking forward to reading this book. It was good for a few pages. And then I wish he'd stopped after chapter 1, but he didn't. But the broad thing I think he gets right is with him, I share this vision of, I like private ordering systems. I like the idea that a group of people can come together and make their own rules and govern themselves by their own rules and enforce those rules and do that in a free and open way. That kind of, there's a hardcore libertarian version of that statement, but that's also the dream of the communitarian statement, worldview as well. There's a broad political spectrum of people that fundamentally share that vision. Wouldn't it be great if we could all come together, make our own rules, weaken forces of power that sit above us, and self-govern to the various utopias we might imagine. Right. So it's a universal dream that many people share. Balaji's Silicon Valley startup guy, that's where he's coming from. I think the core flaw in the book is, but also its power. It comes from just asking that, what would a startup guy do with this problem of how do we fix nation states? And he says, startup states, let's do that, right? Let's bring the Valley into this and do that. And
a little bit uncreative, but I guess not surprising. Not surprising.
You've got a hammer, you use it. So he goes down that path, and he true to form, he consistently goes down that path and goes, all right, entrepreneurship, what's that? So moral entrepreneurship, and all right, finance, what does that look like? And basically runs through the startup dude playbook, but instead of doing this for a product, he does it for a moral idea, which is a group of people come together around a shared moral vision of a society. And so far so good, right? This is not crazy to have that thought. Many people before him have gone down that, and he's also right with the fundamental critique is that why are nations so hard to start, or why are the sort of, when people do decide to try to do that, it comes off as these weird sort of seasteading things, or this sort of LARPy, micronation-y type things. Like it's he is right with the critique that there's a drive to do it and so on. Where I think he goes off the rails, and again, this is it's not I'm not blaming him for this, for not thinking it through. This is a hard problem, but I see this as a challenge of how do you design economies. And again, I've got a hammer and everything to me looks like an economy, so I'm going to come at it from that perspective. But there's this notion of what he's describing as, how do you fix nation states? I think the fundamental diagnosis isn't quite right. I think what we've got is this amazing new tech stack that's crypto and Web3, and we can augment this with IoT and AI and all of the sort of digital technology tech stack that skews heavily in one direction. That it's all pushes toward decentralization, and it makes on a great many margins it makes decentralization better, faster, cheaper in the classic sort of Silicon Valley playbook of what should we be trying to do? So the technological capability to build economies that have digital money, crypto, digital rules, smart contracts, digital organizations, DAOs, digital assets, NFTs, digital agency, wallets, digital agency with smart capabilities, wallets plus AI, digital agents with smart capabilities and geographic, recognition. That's IoT plus satellite. There's a full stack of, incredibly amazing. I don't want to say state building, but institution building capabilities that, not that long ago. I mean, maybe 10 years, definitely 30 years, but definitely within living memory, were the exclusive preserve of not just the nation state, but highly capable nation states working with large corporations in this sort of military-industrial complexy mid-20th century heyday of the nation state sense. And the fundamental thing that has shifted, and credibility to Balaji for recognizing it and going, there's an opportunity, is that tech stack is now in the open. Much of it is open source, not all of it, but a lot of it. Most of it you can put on personal devices that you walk around with. Most of those personal devices that you're walking around with, I can't control. They're distributed. They have peer-to-peer capabilities. You can shield them. And as open hardware keeps developing, eventually you'll be able to build them yourselves. Like, we're not that far away from the full hardware and software tech stack to build your own economies. And now Balaji went slightly sideways with that and said, build your own nation states, and then gave it a name, network states. I think that was the mistake. That what he's actually describing could be perfectly well, the entire logic makes sense as well if you describe that as a group of people come together, a club, around a shared interest. They pool their resources, but it's not the pooling of resources in the sort of socialist sense of how do we govern, how do we create an economy of resources. It's how do we create an economy of resources and the institutional governance of those resources. And that's the bit that is a wide open parameter space. There's different parameters I can set on that institutional governance to turn it into a hierarchy. A different set of parameters will turn it into a market system, if it's and a different set will turn it into a commons. And to my mind, that's the interesting thing we have in front of us now, is that we actually have, for the first time in human history, a sort of almost programmable dashboard of different settings that we can flick on the institutions that we're choosing to. We can choose to adopt these institutions. Most of them are sort of, most of them we can interact with digitally. This doesn't need to be a physical, we don't have to all be in the same place for this to make sense. And what that opens up then is we've got this sort of design space of economies that we've never had before in human history. We've always had binaries. We've had, the market or hierarchy, you've got capitalism, socialism, or or you've got corporatism and whatever else. But it was very difficult to sort of to have this full sort of menu of options. Now we've got that, and we've got that in a relatively distributed sense. It's not we're far from everyone on Earth having these capabilities, but it's within reason that could happen again within our lifetimes or sooner. And that feels like the sort of the new economic problem that we have now. Is it's not just a sort of how do we allocate resources, how do we allocate scarce resources from a justice perspective to ensure that by whatever our standards of justice are, but the economic problem itself has changed. It's not an allocation problem anymore. It's a coordination problem of how do we choose institutional governance in such a way that, in a behind the veil of ignorance type sense, that those institutions provide all of the features all of the things we want around ethics, justice, distribution, safety, every sort of value that you can sort of compose in a list. And where we're stuck on is just how do we do that? Do we do it through the nation state? Do we do it democratically? Do we do it as civil society? And those are social, political, cultural questions. But it feels like that's where we are. So just to sort of conclude my summary there, the thing where I think Balaji went wildly off track was he framed that as a political problem, that this is a us versus them, or a Bitcoin maxis versus the state versus the whatever. And this is where I don't see how we can get political solutions to these types of problems. We're really from any direction here, but that's sort of my high level overview.
So that's super interesting because until now we've been mostly analyzing we've been mostly criticizing the state aspect of the network state, and mostly focusing on the alternative lens that we want to give, which has been until now at least more on the side of the nation, which is more. If the state is an institution that helps people coordinate people, but actually what we care is not the institution of the state, is how do people coordinate. And I think what you're adding here is that, well, in fact, there is already many ways in which people are coordinating themselves, but there needs to be an attention given to the economic institution that enable this type of coordination, as opposed to just the coordination of people, which in this case will be more exclusively on politics. I do think the political aspect cannot at all be evaded, but I think what you're adding is that the political aspect needs to be analyzed or addressed together with the economic aspect, and the innovation that we want to propose with regard to individual coordination also has the opportunity of creating innovation at the economic level, right? And I think the main criticism today of Balaji that we have been hearing and that we've been proposing is, why are we recreating exactly the same institution of the state when we are criticizing the state? And in some way, Balaji is also reproposing exactly the same infrastructure of the economy, and very little innovation at the level of the individual coordination.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. So let me try and sort of sharpen up my argument a bit in that direction. So economists tend to do what economists do, which is that they see the world through the lens of efficiency, not justice or power or other sorts of other values. And this is also true for the study of institutions. So one of the sort of basic foundational ideas in institutional economics is the idea that there is no such thing as a perfect institution. So an institution is just a set of rules for coordinating people to achieve common ends or coordinated ends. So the rules of the game is an institution. What I was saying before, when I was talking about the design space being widely open, what I mean there is that different institutions have different social costs. And we evaluate an institution not by how it achieves its end, but by the cost of it doing so. So there's no such thing as a costless institution. All institutions impose some costs. Those costs can be transactions costs, coordination costs, governance costs, monitoring costs. And these costs are measured in just, someone has to do the thing, right? Or there's time spent doing a thing, or it's someone's job to do something. And different institutions impose different coordination costs, social costs, transactions costs on things. And what we mean by an efficient institution is one that just minimizes those costs. So through the economic lens, what we want to do is we want to choose institutions from the design space of all possible institutions that are the most efficient. Most efficient in this sense means they minimize the total social cost of doing that. Now, these costs can be in many dimensions. So the classic sort of way of describing this in economics is there's disorder costs or costs of chaos, and markets, for instance, have high disorder costs, right? They're chaotic mechanisms. You're willing to but they're very, very good on dictator costs. So markets minimize dictator costs and maximize disorder costs, and that's a point on a curve. A government or a hierarchy has it the other way around. A hierarchy is very good at top-down control, which means that it minimizes disorder costs or costs, but it imposes dictator costs or costs of, sometimes these are called agency costs. But what the point is that there's no such thing as a perfect institution. All institutions trade off on some margins. A commons, for instance, is usually pretty good on disorder costs. It's usually quite high on transactions costs because they don't scale they usually don't scale very well. I think there's what I want to say later on is that I think in a digital economy they do scale very well, which is why they're often highly efficient institutions. So the basic premise of industrial capitalism is that markets are very efficient institutions in most situations because they minimize a bunch of costs, except when they don't, and that's when we use governments to provide public goods or other sorts of things. And the broad sort of institutional economic argument about why economies and societies look the way they do is that they've evolved under cost selection pressure to a set of institutions that minimize social costs in economic production. And that's this sort of mix of some parts market, some parts firms, some parts government. Interestingly, no parts commons is. And it was Elinor Ostrom who sort of first pointed out and studied in enormous detail, saying that the economists were wrong about this, that commons are actually highly efficient institutions in a range of specific circumstances. And she showed when they were. And her argument was not that they're good institutions, they're morally good or they're nice to have, but they are efficient, that they were superior to market government outcomes on an efficiency criteria. And that was an incredibly powerful argument to make because she basically took it to the economists on their own terms and said, this set of institutions is actually the most efficient institution for organizing a bunch of types of resources. And she was dealing with forests and fisheries and physical natural resources. But what's interesting, I think my sort of central point at the moment is that in a digital economy, when we're dealing with knowledge resources or data resources or code resources or resources that have digital existence, which is all of Web3, they are incredibly efficient when organized as a commons. And if that's the case, then that implies that the economic structure or an economy that's built digitally should have commons at the center of its institutional organization, not markets, not hierarchies such as firms or governments. Now, there'll be a place for all of those, but That's the fundamental way that a digital economy is different from an industrial market capitalist economy, is in its mix of institutions.
I'm a bit. I'm not sure how much I can fully agree with the idea that markets are very efficient at reducing dictator costs when we have seen not just because market failure in the sense that not being able to provide particular goods or services, but also inherent concentration of power in specific markets, which do actually become akin to dictator cost. And then on the other hand, hierarchies sometimes, if designed with that purpose, hierarchies can actually be designed as a way to ensure or to preserve or to provide more decentralization of power by creating specific institutional guarantees that make sure that no one can be the ultimate sovereign, right? And if you think about it, a democratic state at least is attempting at doing that, as opposed to a dictator or a tyranny. So I think we also need to be mindful that there are different flavors of market, and some market can be very dictatorial, and there are different flavors of hierarchies, and some hierarchies can be actually more intended to decentralize power despite using power to do so. So that's one thing. And the second one that I wanted to go after is so I completely 100% alignment about how the commons should be the basic premises for creating digital economies. I'm curious by bringing this back to the network state, where I think to me at least, what is novel and what is interesting about this underlying concept that is not the network state is bringing back things also into physicality, and not just being this digital community that are providing digital goods, but an actual community which is both local and global, which is both digital and physical, which both deals with digital resources, digital economies, but also potentially, real world economy and physical goods and services. And to which extent do we need to if we want to maintain the commons framework, which I think will be an interesting thing to explore, to which extent bringing back the physicality and the locality makes things a little bit more challenging, and how can we overcome those challenges?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think, you're absolutely right. Just to take the first point, you're absolutely right about the role of competition, right? So where markets often regularly fail in terms of creating effective dictators in them. We just call that monopoly, right? So monopoly is the scourge of markets because it creates power in that. And this is, in many ways, this is the role of regulation, effective regulation, to try and control that, to create competition in those spaces. That's a perpetual battle. So, and I think, what's interesting over the past few weeks is just sort of seeing how poorly that has been done in banking, for instance. Global banking is basically a series of very, very large quasi-monopolies that have, that's not a market society at all. So so I think this is an argument for why disruption is valuable and useful here. Is that you can control market societies. In market capitalism, the only way to control market power and dictatorship coming up is through equal power from the state to regulate and control that. What's interesting about the sort of Balaji model is that he does throw up a third variation, which is just exit. We just start again. We just throw it all, burn it to the ground, and start again. And again, I'm a little bit drawn to that. The physical side, that's the hard challenge here. And we have to live somewhere. We have we have to have jurisdiction under law somewhere, which means that we have to be either by definition we're going to be in a nation state unless we can sort of exit from that, or have some sort of complex treaty arrangement to overcome that. So the physical side of governance, legal governance over person, and the assets and other sort of property that exists in that space is always going to be challenging. But the question is, I think the interesting thing is the margins of that. Like, is this really about free movement between? And are we fundamentally talking about migration and passports and the ability of me to travel and live wherever I want around the world? And that's with nation states gating that. Is it about free movement of capital? Can I move assets around? Financial,
yes.
or increasingly data, right? Data is increasingly the most valuable asset in the world now. Can that move freely around or not? And we've got this interesting. The 20th century was interesting from a globalization market economy perspective, because you had incredibly free movement of one factor of production, capital, almost no movement of the other factor of production, labor. And that's, we could have had a world where it was the other way around, or neither or both, right? And it's not, but that was what we got. And I think, again, what I like about the disruptive energy of Balaji there is just, all right, burn it to the ground, start again. What would it be to create a new world order where we had that kind of mobility, where people had the same rights as capital, in that sense of mobility. So, look, I don't know what the solutions are to this. It's whether this is sort of one of these things that this is the 21st century, is we're going to spend this time just chipping away at this fight to try and recreate that kind of global openness of physical movement, or whether we completely give up and just go, all right, that's what the metaverse is for, or that's what we travel free. We live in little cages in the ground and move freely through cyberspace. So, like, I don't know. And then
I feel like perhaps the network state maybe is like the realization by some Silicon Valley VC people that actually people probably don't want to live their lives in the metaverse, and so they're trying to find some way to bridge that gap.
Well, maybe. Yeah.
Hi everyone, if you're enjoying this episode so far, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend, and join the crypto leftist communities on Discord or Reddit, which you can find links to in the show notes. If you're enjoying the episode or find the content I make important, you can pitch into my efforts starting at $3 a month on patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist to help me out. As a patron, you'll get a shout out on an episode and access to bonus content like Q&A episodes. You can submit and vote on questions you'd like me to answer, and I'll give my thoughts in roughly 20 minutes. In the last bonus episode, I analyzed applying an anti-capture framework originally made for DAOs, but applied it towards left-wing organizing. Of course, I'll still be making free content like this interview to help spread the message that blockchain doesn't need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation if we put our efforts into it. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out. Also, in case you didn't see it yet, I recently wrote a book review for Outland magazine on, no surprise, the network state, focused on Balaji's misunderstandings of the role of land and statecraft and his insistence to think of everything as a code base, titled Fork Your Society, I Want Out. Additionally, I've written the piece under my real name, so I'm now officially doxxed. I can officially stop bleeping out whenever people say Josh, my name. It was time I came out of the Anon closet, since this is all in preparation for announcements for a book that I've been writing over the past year and a half, titled Blockchain Radicals, but more on that in a later date. For now, let's get back to the interview.
Yeah, I think another interesting question then is like, if we focus, let's focus for a while just on the digital economy, because I guess that's the low-hanging fruit. What is it today that, like, why do we ever need a new concept or a network state or anything? Like, what is it today that is preventing us from actually experimenting with that?
So a number of things. One, so there's a bunch of sort of regulatory barriers that just a lot of the way that economic institutions, regulation, legislation are designed for a type of economy that kind of no longer exists, right? It was one where all productive resources were capital, and capital was physical and stayed in one place and was relatively uniform. So there's just the enormous rise of production at the edges, or this ability of you to do. I mean, so an interesting trajectory that's often not appreciated with over the past 100 years of market capitalism is that market capitalism started with a lot of commodity production in factories that we all more or less got the same things, yada yada, and that sort of became a bit of a as market economies have grown and evolved, we've seen this massive rise in scale of production. You see this in the car industry and the chemical industry and so on. But in many other industries and sectors, what happened was that productive capabilities got pushed out to the edges, into offices, onto your phones, onto your laptops. We see this in education. We see this just the service sector broadly is increasingly like that, and that sort of those parts, in one sense, these are the parts that have struggled with innovation capabilities in many times. They're the parts that we see the most diverse distribution of globalization, where in some countries enormous productive capabilities and wealth and power in those sectors, in other countries nothing at all, and we don't see sort of globalization having really played out in that. So you've got this divergence in economic growth dynamics that you can see sort of starting to come apart in a digital economy, where digital economies are really starting to gather that back together again. And this is not just in a crypto with money and banking, for instance, suddenly taking the power back from taking payments and money and banking and savings technology and that ability back to the edges, where people are able to do that for themselves now, rather than relying on something. That's the fundamental crypto thesis, right? But we're starting to, we saw it with desktop publishing and media and music and so on, and a lot of other things, where this shift went back towards the user, or it's not quite right to say the consumer, because this is a consumer producer at the same time. And it's mostly because they've just got more tools. Many of those tools are digitally native. And those tools are widely distributed. And that sort of user innovation or user capabilities, that's the big story of how market economies have evolved in the last 20, 30 years compared to the 20th century, is it really is shifting away from the sort of factory industrial production capitalism that is the car industry, the transport industry. There's a bunch of industries that are definitely like that and will continue to be. But even ones like energy production are starting to shift now. That energy production used to be a small number of mega production plants on rivers or near the coast that ate coal or whatever, absolute industrial monoliths. It's entirely possible that we're actually through that transition, or we're not through it yet by any means, but it's where there's a tipping point is going to happen at some point, where the energy distribution grid or the energy production system actually becomes mostly decentralized, entirely because of new technologies, right? And so what is happening, so the story I'm telling here is that I think market economies themselves are evolving towards decentralization. Digital is accelerating that path toward decentralization. The end state here, if you look at where is this all going, is massively more complex economies that have enormous amounts of productive capabilities in households, on phones, on laptops, stuff that is protected by encryption and other sort of ways of limiting surveillance and so on, much more peer-to-peer. In that respect, that's not just Balaji that spotted that as well. That's also that's I think that the most significant way to describe, the last 20 years of superclusters of digital technologies is they all point in one direction. There's one exception to that, which was AI in the sort of surveillance capital, the surveillance sort of big data model. But I mean, what we've sort of learnt in the past 6 months is that even that might end up as a series of jailbroken language LLMs on everyone's phones. So this is why I'm sort of optimistic about where I think how economies are evolving. They're evolving past market capitalism, but it's not post-industrial. Where they go next is they become extremely distributed at the edges, not just in terms of production, but crucially, fundamentally in terms of innovation. And this is the new thing that we've never had in the history of, we haven't had for hundreds of years, is the idea that, and this is what I call the innovation commons, but this idea that we've now got these capabilities to use social media tools, to use digital commons, to use platforms and toolkits to pool resources for the use and discovery of technologies, broadly useful technologies. And this is all sorts of things, just sort of DIY stuff around the house, recipes, just sort of low-end thing, but also things like, often to the healthcare space, into sort of experimental design of your own sort of treatments and so on, of things. If we combine a lot of frontier AI technology, ChatGPT type, help me understand how to do this, we've got this enormous shift in where production and innovation is occurring in economies, and that is entirely fundamentally due to the digital economy. And I think we're still just at the start of this. And so what we're sort of starting to see is, what crypto, smart contracts, blockchains, decentralized identity, this sort of full tech stack around building institutions around that enables groups of people to come together and collectively create resources, govern resources, share resources, innovate in that space, i.e. build economies. Now, at no point did I need to say the word nation or state in that context, because what that capability is I think these are economic systems that are being built, but for the first time they're cheap. We can spin up purpose-built economic systems that we just need them to last for the weekend, or we just need it to last for this group of things, or whatever. They're cheap to make. They've never ever in the history of humanity been cheap to make before.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in there that I agree with, and that I also find very interesting, and is like the direction that I think I would have hoped something like the network state would go. I think that maybe I would argue that the economy is probably evolving in kind of both directions in like a contradictory way, where one, production and all these sorts of things are being pushed a bit to the edges, or more, I would say, architecturally decentralized, and they can be placed in many different places. I would argue, though, perhaps the economy has been evolving towards maybe more political centralization, with just like kind of like platforms being sort of like giants, like, yeah, they're huge entities at this point, and they're like very large. Tech companies are, I mean, like Google has a bajillion devices around the world, so it's architecturally decentralized, maybe you could say, and their devices can communicate to 100 different other million devices that are peer-to-peer or whatever, but Google still controls a lot of those things. So I think there's like this, seemingly from the surface like contradictory thing happening, perhaps. And so, but I think what that means, this ability for architectural decentralization is like a seed of like thinking about, okay, what if we had the same type of architectural decentralization, but we've removed like the political actor that is facilitating all these different communications or what have you. And this has big implications for like in a world that is so reliant on information and so reliant on digital tools at this point, like if that is already the case, can we build those things to be not needing to be centralized under some sort of entity? And so like thus like it begs the question of like, can we create like modular parts of what maybe this political entity is facilitating, and allow that to be governed like a commons, or governed in a way that is more democratic than allowing for essentially, you know, what are private dictators to facilitate a lot of this infrastructure.
Yeah, and I think to go back to the original question that we raised at the beginning, which is like, are we talking about politics or are we talking about markets? I think this is like what you're talking about, Jason, is I think a very interesting examples of how a new economy and therefore a potential new market actually has led to a highly monopolistic and highly centralized impact. And therefore, also the criticism, oh, but then the government is regulating all this stuff. And to me, this is where the communication coordination comes in, which is, given the current state of the market, given the potential of the market, and yet given the current instantiation of it, there is a big problem. And so either we need to highly regulate this market and therefore also prevent potential innovation at the margins, or we need to create an actual political recognition and politically understanding that we, the communication people, we, the producer of digital values, can actually choose to move away from this monopolistic market and enter into a more common-based type of market approach. But these require governance and these require politics, and these therefore require this concept of let's recognize us as a tribe, as a nation, as something that we choose to coordinate around this production of value. And we don't really necessarily believe that the existing state regulation is going to find the right solution beyond just breaking big actor down, rather than coming up with a political innovation, which will therefore have an impact on the way in which the market is constructing itself. And to me, this is where the politics and the markets inherently gets connected, and where the concept of a common-based market, I think, cannot exist independently of the concept of a political agency around that market.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think so. How I would frame this topic is, we're in a period now of massive institutional creative destruction or institutional innovation. Like, I think we're going to see more new institutions born and old institutions killed off or extinct or whatever than we have for a while. But that's kind of normal, right? But it's like institutional evolution is not something that just goes smoothly on in the background. We get these huge sort of punctuated equilibria periods where, you know, back in sort of the early 19th century, a huge number of institutions sort of emerged at the end of feudalism and, you know, and so on at the beginning of that. And then they stabilized over a few hundred years. And I think we're in this period now where, you know, as I was saying, this is an incredible period because we've got the design space of institutions is so wide open. The opportunities for institutional innovation are so just rich and deep and global. You know, we're playing with this at a global level. I've always been a bit of a fan. I mean, my central principle here is sort of subsidiarity. That I think you want institutions designed at the lowest possible level, and what that means. What that has traditionally meant for the topic that we're talking about here was industry self-governance. But industry self-governance has a very bad record, and mostly it was just a source of corruption and insider dealing, which is why, you know, the counterpart wasn't industries self-governing and a group of people come together and make their own rules and enforce them. It was like, no. We're going to regulate and use this power of the state to enforce those rules, and you know, that was necessary. And where that worked, it generally worked fairly well. Where it didn't work, we had mostly sort of failed economies because they weren't able to self-govern. But so that's industries, self-governance, failure. Communities have generally been relative, if we think of sort of civil society and, sports clubs and other types of, charities and so on, generally been highly successful at self-governance, mostly because of the scale. They were smaller. They knew each other. The stakes were lower. There was less, to gain by sort of gaining power of that. So, self-governance does work. I mean, through that, we've still got lots of institutions that have done that, but not in the economy. And I think this is the fundamental thing that's shifted now. So, I'm relatively optimistic that these new industries and technologies and capabilities that we've got, the fact that I think a lot of these capabilities are not run by corporate, I think that it's definitely intertwined, but they're relatively widely distributed. There is the possibility that self-governance, can work this time because we've got better governance tools. We've got better ways of communicating, better ways of keeping track of who's involved, better ways of making collective decisions and enforcing those collective decisions. I mean, that is what blockchains have given us, is a new technologies for collective action and creation of that. But the challenge here is we still live in a world of very large corporate players, particularly in tech and finance. Those aren't just large companies. Those are multinational or multi-state sort of companies that span the world. They have enormous power. The only thing that's powerful enough to stand up to that is a consortium of nation states, not just one or two. So with that sort of balance between these two leviathans that we have. I'm hopeful that self-governance has now the new tools to begin this, Cambrian explosion of new institutional exploration and so on. The tools are there, the will is there, the capability is there, but we still live in the world we live in, and which makes my point there is that this is inescapably political. This has to be done through political means because of those things. But I mean, my concern at the moment is actually in terms of politics is just the risk of the education side of it. Just a lot of politicians, I don't know quite what it's like in Europe per se, but in Australia and America, for instance, you've just got tech isn't a high focus, or tech is usually something that is very easy to rally populist hate against. So it's usually easy.
Yeah, I think it's also like the notion of politics is usually associated with the governments and the state. And I think it's also about like reacquiring the power of engaging into politics without necessarily. And I think this is exactly what I think is insane with the network state of Balaji is that he only understands politics at the state level. And therefore, the only way that you can be a political actor is create a new state. Absolutely insane. There are so many ways in which we can engage in politics, and politics is everywhere. It's not just public politics, governmental politics. And it's just that we're so used of thinking of politics only in the government sense that many people that not necessarily relate with the politics of the government don't want to engage in politics, and that they're like apolitical. And actually, that's the problem. Like, if only people were to recognize the value of politics and politics is about finding coordination, finding mechanisms in which people can agree to coordinate themselves and find compromise if necessary. And especially in the digital economy, politics becomes easier to be engaged because we can create our own coordination mechanism, which are common based and so forth. And this is still politics. And this is like a completely different type of politics than the government, and yet it can coexist with it.
Yeah, I strongly agree on that. I think this is the opportunity for the revolution, right? This is a bottom-up revolution of groups of people coming together and self-governing, and because they can, because these tools and capabilities, these new tools and capabilities now exist to do that. But I think what my point is that I still think that's going to be an evolutionary experimental process. That
Right. But I think what you're saying about like what you're interested in, and what I think we are interested in as well, is this idea that yes, we can create our own institutions that don't necessarily have to live within the logic of like a state or a giant corporation or whatever. It doesn't have to be private or public. It could be this third civil sector in which we could now massively explore these types of institutions which historically have not been able to scale, and think about scaling them, taking advantage of digital infrastructure. And so I think this relates to, the points that we made in a discussion with Nathan Schneider, that a lot of the people who were maybe most excited about the network states, who then read it, became very, very disappointed because the space that we have to explore is huge, this design space of institutional design. And Balaji ignored it. He just completely missed the mark on like this huge space of innovation, and instead regresses into trying to impose this like older image of and like very outdated and very like limited view of the state and of markets, and try to reapply that in a like only, in my opinion, like a very slightly different form, if we're being like really honest with ourselves. So yeah, I think the space that coordinations or combinations, we need to stick to one word at some point. But the space that we should be exploring is like this, what you say, exploration of this third sector of institutional design, and creating logics within like digital economies that don't fit within the logic of the things that we are already imposed on at the moment, and which creates these little dictatorships and these little hierarchies that we would rather not be a part of.
Yeah.
And if we think about tactics, right? So I think we are all on the same page here. What I'm curious from you, Jason, is like, so those things. I mean, we already have blockchain. We already have commons, cooperatives, whatnot. So we already have a lot of things that are kind of trying to go in that direction. Some of them for like hundreds of years, some of them just since the last 10 years. What is missing today in order for facilitating this process towards new institutional innovation, common-based economies, and so forth? Like, what is it that is somehow still blocking these efforts, or what it is that is needed in order to bootstrap them, or like give them a trampoline so that they can go faster?
Yeah, that's the right question to ask. So I think on the one hand, there's some barriers that are just a lot of the sort of regulatory infrastructure that we have is designed to control the existing institutions, and it is just often toxic for new institutions. So there is, I think we will need a period of deregulation, then re-regulation, deregulation to break it all up, and then re-regulation to firm it back up again. But there's that. And that's a job for politicians and lawyers and so on and activists to work at that process. The two things I think are needed, though, the constructive rebuilding phase of this. One is a digital economy, and the type we're about to enter into can have far more complex institutions than an industrial economy. A step change in the order of complexity of the institutions it can have. And I mean this in a literal sense of, we can stuff a hierarchy inside a market and wrap a commons around us, and then slice it in half and then repackage it with another. We can just we can sort of modularly assemble institutions to an almost arbitrary complexity now, because we can keep track of them. Because all of the sort of computational information costs of dealing with the complexity, bureaucracy and administration, which used to be a huge cost that would be like a third of the economy, the industrial economy, has, it's not going to go to zero, but it's orders of magnitude fallen. And how we're going to spend that, because that cost has fallen, we're going to buy a lot more complexity. And that enormous richness of the complexity sort of menu is so we need to be able to handle that. To do that, we need toolkits. We need the equivalent of dashboards and keyboards and infrastructure for me to be able to desktop design institutions. And that notion of institutional design, the idea that, okay, we've come together as a community, we need to do a thing to build an economy for our purpose. What's the engineering sort of toolkits that are available to me? Because at the moment, I go to a lawyer, the lawyer says, you need a corporation, or you need a this. And it's like, okay, fine. Are there any other options? Like, no, that's it. Those are your options. So we're entering a world where we need these governance design tools that reflect that sort of rich institutional complexity. And I think, we're seeing the very, very early stages of this with DAO tooling. We're seeing the very early stages of this with, various, tokenomics and so on. I mean, again, this is primitive compared to where we're going. But the point I'm making here is that stuff is not being done by professionals off in the distance. That's something that you will be able to, it'll be that's also at that institutional design at the edges. So we need better tooling and capabilities in education and skill sets to be able to do that. And I think, to me, that's the challenge. And you've now got we will now have the capabilities to design far more complex institutions than any of our ancestors could even imagine. We don't do that. There's a tiny handful of us on Earth even think about the idea of designing economies. But we're about to enter a world where that's a relatively regular thing, and not just real economies. This could be in-game economies. This could be for entertainment. This could be all sorts of things. But just that sort of toolkits and design suites for designing institutions and simulating them and testing them out and just seeing whether they work or not. But to me, that's the positive. What do we need to do to get to where we're going? Is we need to sort of start taking that seriously as a new capability, a new profession, a new skill set, and build tools for that. But I'm optimistic we're going to get there with that. Like, I think it's not going to be immediate, and the versions that we have in front of us right now are pretty primitive. Anyone who's ever worked in sort of DAO tooling will know, but that's an order of magnitude step change in the capabilities that we've had a generation ago.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that definitely designing new economy is a job title that is lacking. way not enough people are doing that. I will try
economy designer.
Yeah, like economy.
I'm a junior economy designer at Blockchaingov.
We will all become your PhD student, Jason. So I think it's a precondition almost, because indeed there is like new potentiality that needs to be explored and figured out. I want to add my own bias and hear what you have to say about that, because for me, while this is a precondition, this is a fundamental building block, I don't think that just doing that will actually lead necessarily to this common-based approach to markets. And again, and I'm just going to repeat it for the sake of the argument, I think that unless we also introduce another type of design, which is like, I don't know what's the right word, but like, it's not political design because this exists for a long time, but it's like the conceptualization of tribes and new typology of nations, which are not geographically bound, which are not nation states, which are also not just digital communities, which are not just like a group of friends, but that recognize themselves as we are something, and we are something that wants to have collective action, and we are also something that wants to have a common pool of shared resources, because we believe that these will be better managed in a common-based manner rather than market-based or rather than public services and so forth. And I think if we don't also introduce this new conceptual entity into the mix, then we might just end up with maybe new markets, but are those new markets really going to lead to anything different than the existing models, except that maybe they will be more efficient, maybe they will be more decentralized, but in the end, are we really creating a whole different social and political structure if we don't also incorporate this new conceptual entity, which is a political entity?
Yeah. So I've always understood that to mean to the idea of what you mean by institutions, where you've got this process of creating an institution, or creating sort of governance and rules around a group of people coming together, shared purpose, to build an economy inside that, to build a social system, to build a cultural system, to build whatever they sort of want within that. But so first of all, you're absolutely right. We don't have a word for that, and we're missing a word for that crucially important concept. In market economies, we definitely have a word for it. It's entrepreneurship or startups, or this process of creating a firm that grows and organizes resources and so on. We don't have the same word for institutions, of this process of creating an institution, building a community growth around that, which is why I love this sort of institutional idea. But the other thing to note is, when we say toward markets, I mean, market systems for an economist are just property rights plus prices, and the property rights system describe how you exchange, the rights of exchange of goods and services and trade and so on, and prices are just the information mechanism for doing the allocation on top of that. The part that's always missing from that description of markets is in a institution that enforces those property rights or creates those property rights, which is always the state. And so when we can start to have a word that describes this process of institution creation, we're also creating the space to understand new forms of collective property and new forms of innovation in property rights or governance rights, or different bundling of how we do that. So I sort of see this as not just a massive design space of institutions, but also a massive design space of property, new types of property. That at the moment we've had private property, there's public property, and there's kind of some one or two weird things in the middle. Whereas what we actually need is this multi-dimensional array of all sorts of different weird types of property that are determined or structured by the institutions that we create. So when we're creating institutions, we're not just creating governance or collective decision making, we're also creating collective or decisions about what ownership means of things or stuff or whatever in that space, and which then gives us maybe different ways in which markets will work, or auctions will work, or price systems will work, or whatever in the background there. So I think this just thinking of this is not just creating new institutions as a way of what are the rules by which we govern ourselves and make collective decisions. It's also, once we have those then structure the space of the types of property that can exist, the way in which those different forms of property work. And again, this is not just physical property. This is intangible property and all sorts of other sort of resources that we can collectively create, including ones that don't exist yet, the sort of ones that are subject to innovation, where we're collectively coming together to imagine and invent new ideas and put them into the and create new types of resources to be used in all sorts of different ways. So there's this notion of what I think, why digital economies are exciting to me as an economist, is I think most of the types of economies that could exist are in that space going forward. And when we look backwards in history, we've had a relatively narrow space of economic choice that has often been institutionally polarized, to various extreme forms just because of the enormous complexity costs of those. Digital economies have far lower institutional costs, which means they can be far more complex. Because they can be far more complex, they can explore more of the institutional space. Because they can do that, there's a lot more different types of properties and resources and innovation that can exist. That feels like we're just right at the beginning of actually getting economies to work in a way that serves the the needs of people and communities and so on, and minimizes all of the harms that sort of power and dictatorships and other sorts of pathologies can come into them. The long 20th century was just a big fight about the nature of pick a pathology. Which one do you want, dictatorship or chaos? And the correct answer was neither of those things. We don't want we want institutions that are fit for purpose, that serve human needs and enable human flourishing, and minimize all of the sort of social costs that incur in that sense. So, in that sense, broadly, that's why I'm in the Balaji tear it all down and start again. But I don't think where he argued that we would, that this means a large political fight. I don't think that's where this goes.
So we're just about the hour. So yeah, Jason, I just want to say thank you for coming on. Maybe to just finish it off, if you want to share with people where they can keep up with you and your work.
Yeah, thank you. So I work at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. You can follow me on Twitter, Prof. Jason Potts, or email me at any time. You can find that there. But check us out at the Blockchain Innovation Hub at RMIT University.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.